Now let's take a look at what happens at the visual cortex once it gets that visual information. What happens there? In a very short phrase, we can describe what happens here in the visual cortex. We do something called feature detection. We don't see objects, or I should say we see them, but we don't perceive them in any meaningful way. We don't see the big picture. We don't process the big picture here. Instead, these neurons are looking and detecting only particular things. And all the neurons that we're going to be looking at respond to the same orientation. So what I mean by orientation, if this is the horizon, this is a vertical orientation, and I have some diagonals, and then a pure, horizontal, and so on. These are all different orientations. You can think of it as a sort of the angle of a line. The processing goes first to simple cells. Simple cells, they just detect an orientation. Is it vertical? Is it horizontal? Is it diagonal? That's it. Complex cells then, if the object was, say, diagonal, so maybe we're looking at this, it would tell you if that object that we're looking at that has this diagonal line, is it moving to the right or is it moving to the left? So it would fire strongly, for example, if it's moving to the right, but it might be inhibited if it's moving to the left. And by doing that, then the other areas of the brain know exactly the direction of this diagonal object. And then end-stop cells would look at this diagonal line, and they would process the length. They might fire one way if it's long, so they might fire a lot if it's long, but they would be maybe inhibited if it was shorter. There's a large variety of simple, complex, and end-stop cells, and each one of them is, in a sense, detecting a very specific thing. The simple cells detect the orientation, and they fire strongly for an object in its preferred orientation, but will be inhibited in the opposite one. So if this simple cell that responds very strongly to that rightward leaning diagonal line, it might become inhibited if instead it detects a leftward leaning diagonal line. Excitation, inhibition, these neurons either start firing a lot more or they start firing less. Same thing, the complex cells will detect that diagonal line, but now they're going to fire a lot if it's moving to the right, but they'll fire a lot less and become inhibited if it's moving to the left. And in doing that, they detect the direction that the object is moving. End-stop neurons, they might be preferentially looking for a longer line, and so if this line that's diagonal is long enough, it will fire a lot, but if instead it's short, it will be inhibited. And there's for all of these, there's another one that works the opposite. So there might be a simple cell that gets really excited and fires heavily when the diagonal line is moving to the left. In the brain, all of these simple, complex, and end-stop cells are organized into these things called hypercolumns. So a hypercolumn is just a collection of columns. And let's start off looking over here. So the different orientations, vertical, diagonal to the left, horizontal, and so on, are all shown up here. If we look now from the surface of the brain, imagine that we pass an electrode and we can measure the activity of these neurons that start from the surface, and then as we move deeper into the brain, notice that all the neurons underneath this top one here that detects horizontal lines, all these other ones are also horizontal. So this is an orientation column. It's a column of neurons that all detect the same orientation. Within the hypercolumn, we can also see that there are neurons that are all what are called left eye dominant, and then a corresponding set of neurons that are all right eye dominant. The left eye columns are the ones that receive input from the left eye, and the right eye columns are the ones that receive input from the right eye. So this is going to be the beginning of stereo vision, the ability to compare what the left and the right eye see. And so whenever we look at a given object, yes, both eyes are looking at the object, and what the brain does is it keeps separate the image from the left eye and the image from the right eye. And that's what these ocular dominance columns are. So it's this whole chunk of visual cortex, which is receiving information from the right eye, versus this whole chunk of cortex, which is receiving information from the left eye. Now notice here and here, we see these things called blobs. These are clusters of neurons that help us perceive color. And there's also tissue and stuff between the blobs called interblobs, curiously enough. And we're not going to do much in this class with the blobs and interblobs.